Restorative practices tend to think of it in education as a program, but it's ultimately a paradigm, right? It's an entire way of being that comes from a belief system that we belong to each other, that no one is disposable, and that we need each and every one of us to do more than just like be surviving out here. So I wanted to just note the dominant culture paradigm that we tend to exist in, and that our systems are designed around education and justice, and how that differs from a restorative paradigm. Restorative justice really sits different when we're thinking about harm repair and when harm and violence occurs in relationship to harm, to violence, to misbehavior, to what we tend to think of as discipline infractions. Restorative justice really views those things as harm to relationships, right? Harm to our interconnectedness, as opposed to societal infractions or school infractions, right? We're being asked to do with restorative work when harm or violence occurs is really think differently about how we're going to tend to it, rather than focusing on that broken rule or that broken law and who's going to get punished. There's a real emphasis on the people most involved and impacted and what they need to tend to healing. So I lift that up because inside of that paradigm is ultimately like a very big conversation about how power is held, who decides what healing looks like, what fairness is a real shift from the way we traditionally think about harm and violence in education and communities and justice. They all sit in a very similar paradigm. Very high level, but I think I would leave it there for now as a starting point. I think what's important to note is the goal of restorative processes is not forgiveness, it's healing. And we can talk a little bit about those differences. I would say sometimes healing involves forgiveness, sometimes healing involves repair, sometimes healing involves relationship restoration, but in restorative processes, none of those things are actually absolutes, right? If we're saying that this is a paradigm of interconnectedness, and this is about the people most involved and impacted, then needs are really, healing is contextual, dependent on my needs and your needs and the people in the room and the community. And there's a lot of different things at play. And forgiveness is not always one of them. Relationship restoration is not always one of them. Those aren't absolutes to being restorative, but the goal of being restorative is about healing. Restorative justice asks us to engage with this really tough question of like, what does it mean to belong to one another? And specifically, when harm happens, what does healing look like when the people that have harmed us belong to us and we belong to them? So when we talk about complexity and being restorative, what we're ultimately saying is like, yeah, let's let it be complex. There's actually a lot of richness in how we tend to it. Puts a lot of opportunities for how we want to address it. And it's not about really asking like, what's the right thing to do here, but what's the first step that I want to try? And it's typically to be really curious about what's happening in the room and what's at play. And that's letting us really like explore all of these larger pieces of like, okay, what I've really found out from this trying to be restorative here is that like, yes, I need to work with these young people about developing these skills, but I need to talk to the school about how they're going to build more space for community building here, because that is also contributing to these fights. So that's just an example of what I mean that I hope I kept simple, but maybe didn't. Forgiveness is healing, but healing is not forgiveness. Okay, I'm going to say it again. Forgiveness is healing, but healing is not forgiveness. Forgiveness can be healing, but again, forgiveness is not a condition to healing, if that makes sense. I would say the piece that I notice the most when working with people that have been harmed or people that have caused harm, it's not always clear cut, and sometimes those live together. The thing that I notice the most is that when harm occurs, they speak to a real loss of agency, that like something was taken from them and they don't feel like they have agency around it. When I think about healing, I think a lot about agency, where I notice that is the desire that people have to like have some sort of agency restored. And I think the really cool thing about agency as the goal is that it's also the process to get there, right? Like if agency is the destination, it's also the path by which we get to that point. It's a design phrase of like the medium is the message, right? Like how we are in the process, we will be in the result when it comes to agency. And so restorative processes can be really beautiful for that, because as I think some examples, there's a lot of opting in with a ton of support along the way. There is ability to say yes or no, or I don't know, or no, but maybe someday, and no, not now. There's spaciousness to move through feelings with support along the way. Healing comes when people feel like they have a sense of restored agency, they feel seen, they feel resourced, and they feel connected.